Tony, what's so interesting since this conflict in Ukraine started was the political parties in the United Kingdom that are so much, I think, important for this conflict. And first, before going to the conflict in Ukraine, do you see any chance of Jeremy Corbyn getting back to the power, even winning the election in the United Kingdom? Do they have any sort of chance, in your opinion?
Well, the irony, you mentioned Jeremy Corbyn because he's been kicked out of the Labour Party effectively. So he's standing as an independent. There's a strong chance he will win his particular seats. But the peculiar situation is that you have a government that's generally disliked, but the opposition party, the Labour Party, is effectively the same. And, you know, an old cynical phrase of mine was, if you want the difference between the Conservatives and Labour, well, it's about 6 months. That's it, frankly. They've got exactly the same foreign policy. Their domestic policies differ a bit, but not such a great deal. And it looks as if the Labour Party will win the election. But I think the most positive thing that one could maybe hope for is that there'll be many more independent MPs. At present, there's George Galloway of the Workers' Party, just has 1 seat. Maybe they could get a few more. A whole lot of other independents who basically reflect a general dislike of the major parties. The major parties, and this is true for both Conservatives and the Labour Party, they have a minimal base, effectively. They have relatively loyal supporters, but in terms of people who will vote for them and go out and canvass for them, you know, they'll get some people doing that, but they don't have an active kind of base on the ground of people who are kind of active supporters. I know, I even did, believe it or not, a few years ago, I did a talk at one of Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party constituencies. And frankly, you know, I don't think it was only me. Maybe they didn't like me and didn't show up, but there were about half a dozen old people in the room, and that was it. And, you know, other ones that I've done, you know, a few years ago now, but, you know, again, there was hardly anybody there. And, you know, and being honest, I don't think it was because they thought the last thing I want to do is go to this guy's talk. I think just effectively they're moribund on the ground and they rely upon a few dedicated followers to do their canvassing. And they're not really a mass party in that respect, although, of course, in terms of numbers of votes, they do get a lot of votes. And they're seen effectively as you've got to vote for one or the other. And what has happened in the last few years, when there's been growing frustration with the current government and not that much happiness either with the previous one, is that a number of more independent people have tried to stand. Their politics are not really that progressive, I must say. You know, and they've often focused on local type issues. I'm pretty cynical about British politics, frankly, and I don't pay it that much attention anymore. I used to follow it more closely in the past. But that, I think what I've just said is a pretty accurate reflection of the situation today.
Yeah. And when this conflict started, if you remember, shoulder to shoulder to the United States was Poland in European Union, and they were in the front line. They were so aggressive toward Russians. We have to do
Yeah.
this. We have to get involved in this conflict. And
Mhm.
as time went by during this conflict, we are witnessing that Poland is being replaced by the United Kingdom. You know, this more rhetoric comes out of the United Kingdom instead of Poland.
Mhm.
Poland just disappeared from the picture, in my opinion. And who's trying to bring, if you saw uh, Boris Johnson recently, he invited
Mhm.
the Azov battalion to the United Kingdom. He said, "You are heroes. You're gonna save Ukraine. You're gonna do this. You're gonna do that." And
Yeah.
it's pretty amazing why they're doing this. How do you find the policy in Ukraine, the policy of United Kingdom?
I just a step back a moment. I think the British have played a big role in Ukraine right from the start, and certainly before the start. They've had a pretty solid Russophobic, anti-Russia stance on, for a very long time. And that's both parties, not just the Conservative Party. In Europe, you find Poland making a lot of noise, and the Baltic states also. Remember, that's partly due to their own history of having, dislike having the Soviet Union. But actually, even that's not entirely clear, because in lots of the former Soviet Union, there was, maybe not every country, admittedly, but there was a lot of people who didn't want it to break up. But the more peripheral countries, or say Poland, one of the bigger ones, they had a long kind of history of antagonism with Russia. So not such a surprise that they're more virulently anti-Russian. The Baltic states have made a big deal of, all kinds of preposterous things, but they've got, frankly, very little to offer except being rabidly anti-Russian. And they're hoping to get political status and support through that as their main selling point, frankly. They've got little else to sell. Aside from all that, you have the UK, and they've had an anti-Russian stance for, the past century or more, well, more than a century. And I think I might have mentioned it when we last spoke, that they even supported Ukrainian anti-Soviet people, even in the 1930s. And they isolated Ukraine as one potential place to get kind of anti-Soviet support. And the Americans, by contrast, had very little involvement in Ukraine, say in those early days. And then in the winding up of the Second World War, the British organized the evacuation of Ukrainian fascists to different places in the British Empire. So, Australia and Canada, for example. And also they helped the evacuation and salvation of many of these fascists to America as well, the US. In the later period, they kept that up a bit, but that kind of fell into the background. But it was a big deal for the British because they had to stress the anti-communist, anti-Soviet kind of aspect of everything in order to try and get the US to back up the British Empire as it then was, say, in the late 1940s and into the 1950s. So that also tallied in with the McCarthyite period in the US, the Arabian anti-communist stuff that they were doing. In the later period, you found really that this anti-communist angle continued, although it was less maybe noticeable. But a big issue for the US, as it became more interested in Europe, following the Marshall Plan and the rebuilding of Europe, was how to make sure things don't get out of hand. And, what was evidently sympathy for the Soviet Union in many countries, particularly in France and Italy, how to prevent forces like that from getting into power. And the British are very much behind that as well. What has happened in the more recent period is that the British have had quite a role, often, I think it's fair to say, in line with what the US wanted, but actually often more extreme, I think, as you mentioned earlier. And that's been true, really, kind of from the outset of the Ukraine war. And even though you could characterize Boris Johnson back in April 2022 as sabotaging the peace talks that were taking place in Istanbul between Russia, Ukraine, with Turkey as the mediator. So Boris Johnson went and sabotaged them by his visit to Kiev. But that is pretty much British policy as well. It wasn't simply that somehow Boris Johnson was just this American agent and he was, doing it just off his own back, being persuaded by the Americans. It's pretty much British policy too. But they realized that they can't have a direct military confrontation. So what they do instead is provide Ukraine with all kinds of support. So they've been, the MI6, the Special Boat Service, the SAS, have done all kinds of specialist training of the Ukrainians. So they've helped bomb the Kerch Bridge, for example, in Crimea. And, they've supplied all kinds of weapons and training, help with intelligence, targeting information, everything like this. So they've been doing that all the time. And because it's less overt than, all the money coming from America and the weapons from America, because the British don't have that many weapons to send, frankly, all you get is now and again some comments upon Storm Shadow missiles being used to, try and hit the Crimean Bridge or other places. But they've actually had a very active role throughout the whole conflict. And I think it's kind of in line with the British approach is to do a lot of stuff in the background. So if it all goes badly wrong, they can kind of pretend they weren't really involved. Nothing to do with us, that kind of thing. But that's the role they play. But they have stepped up more recently in fairly outlandish language. And I think the reason is that the British are in a real bind, right? So with Brexit, they left the EU. So the EU doesn't like them very much anyway. And they've got problems in relations with the European Union. On top of that, they have difficulty making much headway in getting relationships around the rest of the world. So they more and more depend upon the US. And the US in recent years has shown that it's more interested in getting relationships, say in Asia and things like this. So the British are well down the pecking order or the order of priority when it comes to the US. So that leads them into a fairly desperate situation where they want to stress how important they are. So they're the ones coming out of all these outlandish things, despite the fact that they've got a fairly puny military and, not that many troops, not, warships that don't work and all this kind of stuff. So from a military point of view, they've got stuff, but nothing that would ever compete with Russia in anything like a war. But they have to make all these noises and try and encourage other people to join in as well. And that's been a classic British tactic for the last couple of 100 years. Get other people to do the fighting for you. So for, one example more than 10 years ago now, back with the, the attack on Libya, it was basically a British and French deal and they persuaded the Americans to come in with most of the firepower. So the British and French did their bombing and everything as well, but they relied upon the Americans to come in and do most of the firepower. So again, they're doing all this stuff in the background and making a lot of noise in the foreground, but their ability to deliver that much is pretty limited.
Yeah, you mentioned Libya. In your opinion, what was in Libya that was interesting for British government and France?
It's a long story, but briefly, there are two different stories there, really. One is that the French were concerned about Gaddafi, because Gaddafi, being an independent political leader, was making efforts to anything from organizing the pricing of oil in local currencies or not in dollars, for example. But he was giving support to a number of African countries in the North African region. That really pissed off France. And they saw their position being undermined by Gaddafi, and he had a fair amount of money with the oil revenues of Libya. So that was more the French aspect of the Libyan intervention. On the British side, they had plans for Libya, and what they did, they remember Saif Gaddafi, the son of Muammar Gaddafi, right? They organized that he did a PhD at the London School of Economics in governance, right? So this is brilliant. You get the son and heir to the throne, so to speak, of Libya, comes to the LSE, does a PhD in governance, and you make sure he passes. Then, all of the kind of influence aspects that the British are pretty good at, he would be the person lined up to take over and everything like this. So when Gaddafi finally retires, Saif Gaddafi probably is going to be the guy in charge, and they'd run it because they'd have the big influence with him. What happened, though, was the so-called Arab Spring in 2011 and the spread of revolts across North Africa. So that messed things up. And rather than the British being able to gamble on Gaddafi just passing power on to Saif Gaddafi, they then thought, oh shit, this is all falling apart. So whereas in previous years, what they'd done was they'd organized actually the rehabilitation of Gaddafi back into the Western fold to some extent. Gaddafi gives up his weapons of mass destruction, which he didn't have anyway, So he did all that ahead of time, and then did the Saif Gaddafi gambit as well. Then it all fell apart because of the revolts in North Africa. So they decided to go in heavy instead. They thought, okay, the only way we can salvage this is try and make sure that we're going to play a role in new Libya. But they're far too weak. So that's when the Americans got called in, and Libya now is a complete disaster area. So the whole thing was a big mess. But they had their different imperial aims, the French and the British. They cooperated on the war against Gaddafi, Muammar Gaddafi, but they couldn't really do much else, and the Americans moved in, and the Americans couldn't fix it anyway. So the whole thing's a mess. What has happened in recent years is far more positive, which is a number of the North African countries wanting to get rid of US bases and get rid of, the French involvement in many of those countries too. And they're slowly doing that. So that holds out much more hope for these countries to get more independence. And as I mentioned in our previous discussion, they now have more options as well. You have Russia helping them out in many respects, both industrially, with oil refining and things like this, and also militarily helping clamp down on, terrorist groups that are in the region. And China is doing a great deal to help them economically as well. So the developments now are ones that undermine Western power in North and more Central Africa. And, that causes a panic on the part of the French, the British, and the Americans as well. But that's something which is another aspect of all the developments that we're seeing worldwide.
It seems that the policy in Libya was totally backfiring on them because what they wanted to achieve, they didn't achieve it. And it seems that the opposite way is happening right now, as you mentioned, in Africa. And it's a total fiasco. It's a total disaster when you consider all these policies together. Whenever they touch anything, it will die, and it will influence each and every aspect of their interest in that region.
Yeah. No, indeed, it's a sign of their inability. Well, it sounds a bit silly to put it this way, but number one, their inability to control things anymore. It's not as if they had that much control before. It's more a case of effectively using terror and intimidation to get what they wanted. They're in far less of a position now to do the intimidation because there are other forces, say Russia and China, even Turkey is trying to get involved in North Africa. So you have these other options, which a number of these countries can take advantage of, which were not really there in the same way, say, 10, 20 years ago. So it does open up a whole lot of issues, and it's a very positive thing, actually. It remains to be seen how it actually develops, but it's a trend that I think will be very difficult to stop. There are still, many areas of turmoil and instability in other African countries, but I think this is a start. And to have a few months ago, I think it was, Russia had a Russia-Africa summit, and something like 55 countries came to it, even though a number of them had to kind of fly around in circles before they could find a place to find a route to get to Russia from, basically, So again, there are more options opening for many countries in Africa and frankly all over the world as Western power declines. And it's pretty clear, more clear now, I think, to everybody that the West doesn't really have that much to offer.
Yeah. talking about the conflict in Ukraine,
Yeah.
Boris Johnson just he recently was talking about the the United States hegemony in the world. They're not gonna have the hegemony if they don't help Ukraine in this conflict. He was urging the United
Yeah.
States to help
Yeah.
Ukraine fighting Russia. And do you think when it comes to at the same time you're hearing that Emmanuel Macron, he's talking the same way that Boris Johnson is talking?
Yeah.
And when these two, when you consider these two politicians in the European Union, why, in your opinion, what they're doing, why they're doing this? Because are they trying to convince these neocons in the United States that they are Boris Johnson? He's telling that I am the most pro neocon in the European Union, and Macron, it seems that
Yeah.
he's trying to say no, I am the leader of Europe. How do you see these two people are?
Yeah. It's basically I don't want to put it down as psychological, but I think the 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 psychological kind of unity between those two is a narcissism for one thing. They want to kind of show their importance and promote themselves, all this kind of thing. But the underlying reason behind that form of narcissism, rather than just trying to go on television or something, is that they really do fear, and it's a real fear right across the European political class. That's the UK as well as the rest of the EU. A fear that they're losing power and position in the world. So they realize actually that they can't do much about the fact that Russia is winning in Ukraine. They can't really do anything about it. So they're panicking, hoping maybe something will happen, or maybe the US will get more involved, this kind of thing. They themselves can't really do that much, apart from, sending mercenaries and these missiles and various other extra bits of armaments for Ukraine. But Ukraine is losing a huge amount of people every single day. And the recent figures admittedly from the Russian Ministry of Defense, so, some people won't believe them, but the figures they show are, if you like, confirmed by the growing graveyards all across Ukraine. And they show that whereas towards the end of last year, the average number of wounded and killed among Ukraine's military was about 700 a day on average. It went up and down between 400 or 500 up to 1,000, this kind of thing, bouncing around, but the average is about 700. In February and March this year, the number was 950. What has happened in the past 2 weeks, it's more like 1,500, 1,600 a day on average, killed and wounded every single day. And even from the point of view of the mercenaries that are sent, well, it was either early hours this morning or yesterday that Russia blasted one facility in West Ukraine, and reports of about 300 people being killed. It was a NATO and Ukrainian assembly point. And some figures put out a couple of months ago, again by the Russian Ministry of Defense, so you can believe them or not, but I think these are plausible. They showed that since the war started, about 13,000 foreign mercenaries have come into Ukraine, mostly from Poland, about 1,500 or so, if I remember correctly. Then 500 or 600 from, say, I think Georgia, which the US is trying to wind up, and Europe is as well against Russia. And a fair number from Britain, about 500, and then from France, a bunch of other countries, and all over the place, basically. So over 13,000. 45% of them have been killed. And a fair number of the remainder have run away, frankly, or decided that it wasn't such fun after all. It's not like killing Afghan peasants or something like this, you know. They're actually facing a real army with real weapons. So they've had real problems getting mercenaries in, and the Ukrainians themselves have run out of people, more or less. You know, so they've had to lower the age of conscription. They're trying to conscript women as well. And, you know, all these sorts of things are going on. But Ukraine is losing badly. They still have a large army. And what happened between 2014 and 2022 was that the NATO forces were backing Ukraine, building up huge defensive lines in eastern Ukraine. And these are not easy to take. You know, if you have underground tunnels, trenches, fortifications, etc. So all of these were built, and that sort of slows the Russian advance from the east of Ukraine further into the center. Then you had this slightly absurd story in recent weeks of Russia is doing an attempt to create a so-called safe zone around the Kharkov area, which is on the east, towards the northeast of Ukraine, not far from the Russian border, and it's a strong Russian-speaking city. It got infiltrated by Ukrainian fascists a number of years ago. So that's changed the character a bit, but it's still largely a Russian-speaking, sympathetic city to Russia. So Ukraine was meant to have built a whole lot of fortifications around this city, you know, in the outskirts and all close to the border with Russia to prevent the Russian advance. What happened? They stole most of the money and didn't do any of the fortifications. So it's kind of, you know, a preposterous thing where Ukraine, which was called on many Western headlines in 2020 and 2021, the most corrupt country in Europe, etc., they then didn't want to talk about that, you know, once the war started, but it's still happening. So, you know, a lot of the weapons that NATO has sent have been sold on the black market. Not all of them, of course, you know, the bulk, of course, goes to the Ukrainian army, but a fair number are sold on the black market. Money allocated or given to build fortifications ends up in somebody's pocket and buys, you know, another villa in a foreign country for one of Zelensky's crowd, you know. So all of this stuff is happening all the time. It then leads to this preposterous situation where, you know, Ukrainian troops are being sent to the slaughter by Zelensky's regime. And, you know, apart from that, what has now happened is that technically his period of office has finished, and there's no real legal way for him to extend his presidency. There's nothing in the Ukrainian constitution that would allow that. So Russia is no longer willing to have any negotiations with Zelensky, you know, for frankly pretty obvious reasons, but now they have a technical legal reason not to even want to speak to this guy anymore. So in the end, there'll be negotiations, as there kind of always is. But the negotiations, I think, are going to be more like unconditional surrender rather than anything which the West would like to have, you know, some kind of give and take, really. So, yeah, that's the situation, and as it stands, you know, that there have been advances by Russian forces in the east of Ukraine, around the Kharkov area and all along the front line, which is over 1,000 kilometers long. But it's been pretty slow, frankly, and the whole thing has gone much more slowly than I would have thought. It's partly due to Russia not needing to go much faster. Partly they don't adopt the NATO policy of bombing the hell out of everywhere, flattening it, and then declaring victory. You know, they consider Ukrainians to be brothers, effectively. So, you know, they've taken it easy, you know, in usual NATO war senses, nothing like what NATO or the US has done in the past. And I think time has been on their side. There's no great reason for them to rush. And I think the only reason for them to speed things up, and I hope they do, is that because the West is becoming far more desperate, and you find these statements from Macron and from Boris Johnson and, you know, a bunch of other people all around Europe, I think it's probably time for Russia to speed things up in order to, you know, get more facts on the ground and make it pretty evident that they've got no chance, no hope, really. So I think that's what's going to happen in the coming months. You know, I've been wrong on thinking how quickly this would end, you know, for quite some time. So you can't bank on my expectations in that respect. But I think that strategically, Russia has a lot of the non-Western world on its side. It's in a far stronger position economically. Militarily, it's in a far stronger position. And, you know, the hypocrisy of the West becomes evident completely in all respects. And I think the hypocrisy regarding Gaza, for example, is now feeding into people thinking, wait a minute, if they can lie through their teeth about, you know, the genocide going on in Gaza, maybe they're not telling us the truth about what's happening in Ukraine as well. You know, so I would hope that would be a conclusion that thinking people would draw.
Do you, in your opinion, as Russia is fighting Ukrainians in Kharkiv, as you mentioned, and they're trying to make a buffer zone, a safe zone in that region.
Yeah.
And do you think that they are modifying their policy in Ukraine in this conflict in Ukraine, or their policy is the same policy that they started with? And the other thing would be the situation of Odessa, because Odessa is so much important. Do you think Russia is getting to the point to capture Odessa?
I think the underlying policy is the same, you know, it is, if I remember correctly, denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine. And those things have gone on and have worked pretty well. So initially, the main objectives, I think, were more limited to the Donbass area, and that was in the first month or so. And that was around the, you know, these April discussions. So a couple of months in, you had the April discussions. I think it was in April, the Istanbul discussions. Russia would have been kind of happy with just having some independence for the Donbass region in order to protect it from the attacks that have been taking place. What has happened since is a very evident European, US, UK policy to defeat Russia strategically. And all of the efforts that have been made to, you know, build up an anti-Russia in Ukraine. So I think from that point of view, the Russian objectives have changed and they've become harder. So they would want to take more of Ukraine, not necessarily to have extra regions, because the further west you go, the more anti-Russian, if you like, the ordinary people are, and especially in the west of Ukraine. But when it comes to Odessa, I think it's a different ball game. And I think the Black Sea coast, including Odessa, will be taken and has to be taken. But I don't see that happening in the next few months. That might be end of the year at the earliest and maybe early next year. It's important for Russia to do that because of the strategic issue regarding the Black Sea. And if Odessa is left in Ukraine's hands, then it becomes a base for attacking Crimea, which it has been already. So I don't see how they can leave the Odessa question left out and, unresolved. And it was one of the explicit points made by Putin right at the start of the war, that they want revenge, basically, for the atrocity that occurred with in 2014, I think it was, with, the burning of, several hundred trade unionists in that building in Odessa. So they want to bring people to account for that atrocity. So I think that's going to happen. And it's going to be necessary in particular because NATO has gone out of its way to build up forces in Romania and trying to do extra forces also throughout the whole of Eastern Europe on borders with Russia. So I think taking Odessa is going to be an important objective. It hasn't explicitly been stated, if I recall correctly. I don't think they've come out and said, this is what we're going to do and whatever, because, it's a step-by-step approach. And in a way, they're in no big hurry. And it's the same with Kharkov, that I think Kharkov will be taken as well by Russia, but it's a big city, and you can't just steam into a big city. You would need, 100,000 troops at least to even begin to do that. So I think it's more going to be creating a safe zone around Kharkov so the Ukrainians can't have these easy attacks into the over the border areas into Belgorod, for example. But what we've found is that, in the past week or so, there have been a couple of attacks on important Russian radar stations, which are important strategically for early warning signs against ballistic missiles. So, frankly, anything within 1,000 kilometers or whatever is got to be a problem. And NATO, in a way, is digging a bigger hole for itself in that respect if they want to save any bit of Ukraine. And I don't think that a settlement, for Russia's interest, their settlement will include any ability for Ukraine to have a military. So, that's, and I think they're going to be in a commanding position to bring that about. So again, summarize, whereas, back in February 2022, Russia looked like it would be pretty happy with just having the Donbass region having some independence. But what has happened since has made it very clear to Putin, if it wasn't clear before, what the overall strategy of NATO, the US, and the Europeans was. But it is very clear now, and they don't have much choice if they want to push back that threat to their security.
Yeah. The other conflict is in Georgia right now. Do you think what's going on in Georgia is a distraction for what Russia is doing in Ukraine? They're trying to distract Russia from their focus in Ukraine, or is something so real and we have to consider it as a real problem in Georgia?
It's a problem, but I don't think it's a big one. And I think it's just an example of, almost following through chapter by chapter of this RAND report that came out, I think in 2019, extending Russia. They have a section on Georgia. And in the latest period, the absurdity gets even more because, as you probably know, the law, which is the cause of all the ructions now, or the law on foreign agents, is very similar indeed to the US law. And just in the past day or so, this adds to the absurdity. The Europeans themselves are drafting a law to, identify foreign agents or make clear where people's funding comes from. And that's what the Georgian law is up to. It's saying if more than 20% of your funding comes from abroad, then you have to declare it. Not we'll close you down and put you in prison, but you have to declare it to make it obvious. And if you look at the publications and the websites of US Agency for International Development, what's the other one called? National Endowment for Democracy, and the European Commission, they've got lists of people that they fund and money that they've given over the years to different institutions in Georgia to promote democracy and all this kind of stuff, right? And it's a democratically elected government that is doing this. And there's, many people have pointed this out, that the president of Georgia is something like half French or something. I can't remember the exact details. But, she was, I think the French ambassador to Georgia ended up getting Georgian citizenship. Then I didn't follow these details, but she became the Georgian president. And then caused a big, ruckus by vetoing this law, which was passed, a couple of weeks back. And but the Georgian constitution says that if there's a vote in parliament to overturn that, it can be overturned. So it has been overturned. And what you get are, lots of people coming out on the streets to protest this. And often they're carrying, US flags, European Union flags. And it's this kind of false hope for, a better future, which is a common theme that the West offers to, say, younger people in particular, but the middle classes, that, you don't need to be this backward, poor, whatever words they want to use about these countries. You can be, wonderful, forward, progressive, well off, drive around in your Mercedes or whatever if you join the West. And it's a complete lie, because there's no way they would let them join the European Union, even if they didn't have this damn law, right? It would be years and years away, not, something happening in the near term. So it's using it as a means of bullying and trying to get influence in the country. And you commonly find that it's not that difficult to get, even tens of thousands of people on the street through these sorts of methods. And it looks like a lot of people, but when you consider the size of the country and, the population, it's not that much. And so that needs to be taken into account. And I think that the lesson of Ukraine will be learned by people in Georgia. And the government, the Georgia Dream Party or something like that, I've forgotten the exact name, they're not really pro-Russian or anything. They just want a bit of independence and don't want to be bullied around by the Europeans or the US. Simple as that, really. And that's where this law comes from. And I say the law is pretty much the same as the US has, pretty much the same as the Europeans are now drafting. So, it's not really the law. It's just their means of bullying is not working that well. And that's what they don't like.
Yeah. Yeah. When it comes to the conflict in Israel, we've learned, pardon me, in Israel right now, we had many changes in the conflict in Israel. Ireland, Norway, and Spain, they are recognizing Palestine as a state. And ICC was issuing an arrest warrant for Netanyahu, and ICJ, they were trying to convince Israel not to attack Rafah. And at the same time, we are witnessing that Israel is attacking Rafah, and they don't consider any of these pressures coming from the international community. In your opinion, what could have been done, considering the pressure on Netanyahu to bring him to some sort of sanity? Is that possible in your opinion, or it's totally getting out of the hand?
Firstly, I'd say it isn't Netanyahu, really. Frankly, they're all like that. Different versions of this. I mean, this is extreme on a bigger scale on all the TV stations, social media, and everything, right? So it's very big, and it's a genocide, which it wasn't entirely before. Before, it was a slow motion genocide. This has been going on, since 1948. So, and there'd been various versions of this in the past. You had Ariel Sharon, you've had all kinds of other, so-called extremists. But when you look at the people at the other end of the spectrum, political spectrum in Israel, they have pretty much the same views. And Israeli opinion, also by opinion polls, seems to show a good majority of the country may not like Netanyahu, but they may not like him because they think he's too soft on Gaza. He should flatten Gaza completely, or should, go in a way that gets the Israeli hostages out but kills all the Palestinians, that kind of thing. So it's not Netanyahu or this particular government, it's the whole regime, the whole Israeli state, frankly, that is based upon ethnic cleansing, racism, and genocide if necessary, which it often is in their view. So, they've had Gaza as a prison camp for more than 10 years, I think since 2006. Quite a long time since Hamas was elected there. So, yeah. What can be done? Well, the problem you have is that Israel in practice has had impunity. One good commentator on Twitter or X, I would recommend Elijah Magnier. He did a listing of all the UN resolutions that Israel has ignored. It's, a couple of hundred long, going over, 40 years or more. And so, ignore, because things like UN resolutions have no role unless they're passed by the Security Council. And guess who on the Security Council will not allow anything like that to pass? The US, of course. So in practice, Israel has had impunity. And the more that the Western powers are allied in with the US, but also see that Israel plays this role for them, which it does, of, you know, keeping wraps on the region, they also support Israel. You know, the British obviously do. And we've seen from, you know, the French, the Germans, you know, a whole bunch of others. And if you look at the recent recognition of Palestine, you know, Norway, Ireland, and Spain, number one, you've got to ask yourself, what the hell took them so long, right? And number two, doesn't really mean that they have to do anything. Doesn't mean, oh, we're recognizing Palestine, or we really don't like what's going on in Palestine, so we're going to do, say, a trade embargo on Israel. No, no way, they're not going to do that. And Europe, the UK, and the US have all kinds of special trade deals with Israel, allowing easier, you know, transactions and everything else. So, you know, in the economic sense, quite apart from the delivery of weapons. And, you know, as a lot of people know, the US is the biggest weapons supplier. Germany is number two. The UK is probably not that big in practice, but the UK, as well as the US, does a lot of spying for them. You know, the flights over Gaza to help with targeting is happening every day, every week by the UK as well as by the US. So the problem is this impunity backed by the major powers, and it's difficult to see how that can be it can be challenged in the sense of, you know, people boycotting Israeli goods, or, you know, trying to undermine military support. But it's difficult, I must admit, and it would be, you know, breaking law, etc., doing all that. And even going on a damn demonstration now, if you do that in Berlin, you get your head smashed in by the police. You do it in Britain, not so much. You do it in a bunch of other countries, say in Paris, equally, you get pushed around by the police. That's even just a demonstration calling for a ceasefire. So the power of the Western states in favor of keeping their rabid attack dog in place is a difficult one to overcome. And the most we're seeing, I think, is because this is, you know, disgusting and outrageous what is happening. You know, even the most mild-mannered liberal, willing to go along with anything the TV tells them, you know, would be disgusted by this. So the most that would happen as a consequence of that is that, you know, there might be changes in voting or something along those lines, but it's frankly difficult to see much that could happen which is not breaking the law as they've set down. Much that could happen which isn't breaking the law that would have much of an effect. You know, hopefully the broader change in opinion would have a political effect to some degree, but, you know, clearly not on the Democrats in the US, maybe the odd one here and there. And maybe, you know, they get a bit worried about votes among younger people and students and things like this. So, you know, but all they do is come out with a different formulation. they say, oh, no, we're really against, we want to make sure that Israel doesn't target civilians. They only go after Hamas. And, complete joke, really. So they're basically backing the mass murder. And all of these countries are. So I don't see an easy solution to that. It would need to be basically military action. And, the people doing that are Hezbollah in Lebanon and Ansarallah in Yemen. And they are having an effect. But they're not necessarily in a very strong position to do much to follow through on that. I think both of them are actually. Ansarallah is stepping up and he's more or less blocked off the Red Sea completely now, and has made efforts to attack further into the Mediterranean coast. And the resistance groupings in Iraq as well as Lebanon are doing more also. And I think, given how outrageous things are, that will step up. Even Erdogan of Turkey has now called for, Islamic states to come together to do something. But I think it's only that kind of state action by a lot of them that will have much effect. And, because in the meantime, you're getting Israel is still selling its bonds to investors in the US, and it's still getting its aid from the US government. And it's actually selling its bonds to a wide range of countries. And I think it will take a while before you get more kind of, if you like, asset managers or people like this who decide that actually it's a bit toxic having an Israeli asset on my books, that I went and bought this Israeli bond. What they've done up to now is just say, oh, the yield is quite good. We think we'll get paid back, so it's not a problem, right? We'll turn a blind eye to anything these guys do. And it's anti-Semitic if you start calling them genocidal. The moves by the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, they don't have any power to implement anything. But I think they are important signals for a change in the political status of Israel. So from that point of view, it could have quite a big effect, at least in undermining their impunity and, hopefully further things. But I think, short of military action, I can't see really that they're going to stop. And they would need to be forced to stop, say, by the US, who fears things getting out of control. That's probably the best option that I would see.
Yeah, just to wrap up this session, do you see at the end game in Rafah right now, they're trying to, since this conflict started, they're trying to push these people from the northern part to the southern part right now, to the central part of Gaza Strip, then next to the Gaza Pier. And do you think that it seems to me that there are some rumors that the policy, the official policy would be they're just killing as much as they can and send the other people out of Gaza, just evacuating them from Gaza. And how do you see this is the end game on the part of Israelis?
I think it's definitely their plan, and they're doing a similar thing actually on a smaller scale in the West Bank. So they always had a plan for kicking people out of Gaza into Egypt, into Sinai, and kicking people out of the West Bank into Jordan. that's been a long-standing plan on the part of the more radical Zionists. The difficulty now, I think, that they would face is this general world political one. And Egypt, which, they've done very little, actually. There was a clash the other day on the border near Rafah between, Israeli troops and the Egyptian forces there. But already, as part of its long-standing ignoring of any UN resolution, there's meant to be this, neutral corridor in the south of Gaza, the so-called Philadelphia corridor. It's part of the so-called Camp David agreements, right? They've ignored that completely. They've got fucking tanks there now, So all of that's being ignored, but it's then a question of what will Egypt do? And Egypt is in the pocket of the US, effectively. They don't kind of want to be, but they've not done much about it. And it's a case of all of these countries have generally been in a pretty weak political position, but they're finding that their populations are getting more and more angry about their stance. So there'll be big Palestinian demonstrations in Jordan, even though Jordan is helping out the Israelis militarily with, they were helping kind of fight off the Iranian missiles a few weeks back. So it's something that can't really be resolved outside of military action, frankly. And I think the US policy looks like it's it's clearly not an aid thing, this Gaza pier which has fallen apart anyway, but it as a complete joke. And it seemed to be, I'm not entirely sure what the US policy is, and I'm not sure that they know what their policy is either. It seemed to be an excuse to put an American base next to Gaza, partly because they were afraid of things falling apart with the Israeli state. So they wanted to make sure they were there to keep tabs on things more directly, rather than just having a big, military arms dumps that they've got all over the place in Israel. But I don't know really whether they think they can pull that off, because they would more directly come under attack from all kinds of resistance groups in the area. And, they're already getting a bit concerned about that. What do we do if, if a Hezbollah missile comes over or we're attacked from Iraq or something like that? So as it stands now, it's not something that really can be solved, frankly, as long as there's an Israeli state. Maybe sounds a bit extreme is not the word, because what we've got is extreme, but as long as there is an Israeli state, this cannot be resolved. That's what it comes down to, really, because you have a state which is based upon theft of land, racism, and genocide. So as long as that kind of state exists, nothing can be resolved. Simple as that, really. And what happens regarding Gaza, they will do as much as they can to kill as many as they can and think they will get away with it. And up to now, they have got away with it pretty much. But, the more they're brought into, their proper status of being a toxic state that everyone should isolate, that until that happens, they're just going to continue, really.